This is 20 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. On today's podcast, my guest is TransGrid Advisors Principal Jay Caspary. Jay is going to describe the macrogrid initiative aimed at integrating the segmented regions of the U.S. electric network to make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. He's also going to talk about his work on the Department of Energy's landmark 2018 SEAMS study, which validated the value of the macrogrid concept. Jay's almost 45-year career in electric transmission began with 38 years in system planning with Ameren, Illinois, and the Southwest Power Pool Regional Transmission Organization. Along the way, he made short but important stops with the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and its Office of Energy Reliability and Grid Deployment. He became principal of TransGrid Advisors in July 2024. So, Jay, let's start with the basics. What is the basic idea of a macrogrid? And at a high level, what needs could an integrated national transmission macrogrid type system meet that aren't being met today?
Great question, Herman. First of all, thanks for letting me be part of this and joining you on this webcast and share something that's near and dear to my heart. Before we start, I'd like to give credit for the term macrogrid. It was created and coined by Dale Osborne, who has retired from the Mid-Continent ISO. Dale was a very impressive power systems engineer that has background experience in HVDC technology as well
High
as
voltage, high
high
voltage direct.
voltage direct current. That's right. So basically, a macrogrid is a set of HVDC lines with dedicated fiber and communication to help control its functions. More importantly, it would be a network of HVDC lines and substations that integrate with the existing AC substations at key nodes.
Mm,
The macrogrid would be self-redundant and use multi-terminal voltage source converter based HVDC technology. VSC or voltage source converter based technology is innovative, and it has been leveraged and used most recently in Europe and other parts of the world to basically add control functions to the flow and the parameters of the voltage, the current that are injected and withdrawn at nodes where these substations would be. The macrogrid would overlay existing regional plans to make the power system more of a national grid from coast to coast. Macrogrid terminals offer very large opportunities for grid management and enhancing the system's security during routine as well as extreme operations. If you look at the macro grids that have been thrown out there, the one from the SEAM study, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was a kind of a landmark effort, like you mentioned, to look at what could the future grid of the U.S. look like in 2035, for example. And keep in mind, this study was started in 2015, so it was looking out 20 years. And we wanted to integrate and interconnect the eastern and western interconnections of the U.S. The U.S. is served by three interconnections right now. The ERCOT, which is the majority of Texas, is separate and distinct asynchronous grid from the eastern and western interconnections. But the study that we did to look at a macro grid was one of the solutions that was evaluated as part of that SEAM study. With that, I think hopefully that helps at least answer the
yeah,
question.
yeah. I got to go back for a minute. Dale Osborne, what year did he coin that term? Do you remember?
It's been 20 years ago in
Interesting.
my memory, and Dale it is a great engineer
I
and
remember
wonderful experience.
I remember it was about 20 years ago that then Senator Harry Reid of Nevada had a big conference in Las Vegas, and all the major government figures, uh, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, all kinds of people were at that conference talking about this kind of, I don't remember whether they used the term macrogrid at that conference. It was a big deal at the time, but they talked about a national transmission system. So that makes
Right.
sense that he would have coined that term then. Um,
Right.
and I just want to say one more thing about what you said. It gives listeners an insight into the fact that you can't just build some wires and plug them in like you do in your house. They have to match what's already out there. And that's not a simple job. It takes really serious engineering, but you guys did all that thinking. And that's what I want to get to now, Jay. You have a unique perspective on this because you were part of DOE's landmark SEAM study. What was your role in it? And more importantly, what did the study show about the operational values and the potential costs and benefits of an interregional macrogrid type system?
Yeah, I was part of a very big work team that was led by folks at the National Renewable Energy Lab at the time, now the National Lab of the Rockies, that had all of the models and the data and the computer capabilities that we needed to do these very large scale simulations, to look not only at the reliability of the power system, but more importantly, the economics of
Right.
how can we make it more efficient with less congestion, with the ability to share capacity, reserves, ancillary services that you need to keep the lights on. And to
And and to build that, it's going to cost a lot of money. So it's important to understand what are the costs and what are the benefits, right?
definitely, yeah. Well, Dale and I were kind of the industry co-leads for that. He was at MISO at the time. I was at Southwest Power Pool, and we what I wanted to do, given that I was at Southwest Power Pool, we were basically the western edge of the eastern grid, okay, in the
Mm,
U.S. And we had expanded our footprint from the traditional Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, Arkansas, up north into Nebraska, and then all the way into the Dakotas. So that basically, over the course of my career at SPP, and and then we basically went from the Canadian border all the way down to New Mexico, and the back-to-back DC ties that connected the eastern grid with the western grid were aging. They weren't effectively utilized, in my opinion. They were kind of bottlenecks between the systems, but they had a purpose from the 70s and 80s, which was much different than the needs today. Okay.
right.
And what we wanted to do in that study was to look at options. What would happen if we would expand the AC system capacity between the eastern and western grids? Today they're separate grids. They are asynchronous. You can't connect them. Even though back in the 60s they tried, okay, to
Sure.
connect the systems, but the systems were so weak, okay, that if something happened on one grid, it would adversely affect the other grid and pull lots of power across very weak lines, okay, and trip them out. So that didn't work. So they ended up putting in these back-to-back DC ties, so that people that had resources and loads on both sides, whether it's in Wyoming or Nebraska or whatever, they could move the power back and forth to meet their own local needs. So we looked at, what could we do? Could we expand those DC ties? Could we put in big HVDC links between major nodes in the eastern grid to the western grid? Or should we consider an overlay, which became the macro grid? So
Uh,
that option was looked at. All of those options are feasible technically. Um, I think at the time we were estimating that the macro grid would cost about $80 billion. So that was 10 years ago. I'm sure it'd be a lot more than that today with supply chain issues and everything else going on with inflation and cost. But the key thing is we saw that the benefits of that would be at least two times the cost in terms of reducing the congestion on the grid, the ability to share reserves, to share capacity, to deploy the best renewable resources at the time. There's a lot of onshore wind wanting to be developed in the plains, and a lot of solar that was wanting to be developed in the desert Southwest. And if those resources actually complement each other, if you look at the patterns of the wind, basically primarily in the plains, coming up late afternoon and being very strong through the night, coming down in the morning, just the opposite of the solar patterns in the desert Southwest. But there's no way to put those two resources together without a grid. Okay. And we could do that with HVDC lines. We could do that with AC lines, maybe. But we wanted to really look at the potential benefits of a macrogrid. And it was the most costliest alternative, but it provided by far the biggest benefits. And one thing about the benefits we quantified, it was very conservative. Okay, we did not get into the operational benefits of being able to deal with resiliency type events. Okay, since then we've had Storm Uri and Storm Elliott, and you see these opportunities for us to create a grid that is bigger than the weather, right? Or bigger than the storms, because it moves from west to east or north to south. And what we've seen is we typically can't lean on our neighbors. We need to lean on our neighbor's neighbor or even three neighbors away, because they may have plenty of sun, solar resources in the desert Southwest when the cold front is in the heartland of the U.S. and we can't get the gas units fired up or whatever, and the wind may not be blowing as much as you want. But the benefits of a macrogrid would allow us to take advantage of the diversity of the loads, as well as the weather patterns, as well as the resource mix, and sharing cost. It lower the cost of power to everybody, which is one of the real benefits.
I was thinking, it's not just wind or solar from the Southwest that could be spread all over the country. It's also, for instance, hydro. Canada has lots of hydro, and it's connected and has recently become even more connected to some of the U.S. grids. I was thinking that PJM, which is sort of mid-Atlantic, could get hydro from Canada through MISO if it was interconnected. And there's even times when various nuclear plants, they have to keep running, so some of that nuclear energy could be sent from anywhere. Most of the regions of the country have that. It's a way to use nuclear more efficiently, even, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We want to base load those units, and you don't want to cycle large thermal units like nuclear plants. And yeah, if you could use the hydro resources better, wouldn't that be wonderful to help balance out the other needs of the system? There have been projects proposed to connect Ontario to PJM, and there's a lot of Canadian hydro that gets into the Northeast and into New York and into MISO too, as well as California.
So look, it's become obvious in many ways that these kinds of connections could be beneficial. Based on what you saw when you're doing the SEAM study and your years of experience in planning and building transmission at SPP, what are the real world barriers to development of an integrated national transmission system, and how can they be addressed? How can you, and don't talk about permitting and siting, because we're going to get there in a few minutes, but just the other things like cooperation between regulatory jurisdictions and that sort of thing. What are the real world barriers here?
The real world barriers to building large interregional transmission lines is there really is no mandate. Okay. There's no standard that says we need to have 20% capacity ties to our neighbors based on our peak demand. In Europe, that's the standard. And you kind of know how much you need to increase your transmission capacity with your neighbors. And there's efforts underway and conversations about, what is the right target, right? How much capacity should you build with your neighbors. Right now, the regional planning that's done is very good. Okay. If you look at what MISO's done, or Southwest Power Pool, or PJM, or CAISO, New York, New England, the really, really good regional plans, but it stops at the regional border. They don't necessarily look at what they could do together, and one of the things that has been a success story lately is SPP and MISO have done some joint planning in the Missouri River Valley, and have agreed that there's a group of projects that make a lot of sense for both parties. And to me, that was really a landmark study too. And to the point that the DOE recognized that this is a really good thing to do, and we need to probably help contribute to that with some GRIP funding, which may be uncertain at this time. But we need more projects between regions. And there's merchants that are trying to do this, okay, to take advantage of diversity of resources across the grid, and the value of sharing capacity, and getting lower cost energy to load centers, especially with all this push for the data centers and AI and all this.
Yeah, I want to just add there have been for, I don't know, 10 years or so, folks, merchant builders. That means independent transmission builders that work outside the normal regulatory formats that have done this. And the only thing that has really stopped them have been these sort of self-interested state rulings, and most recently the Grain Belt Express that would have come from Iowa across into Illinois was stopped when the Trump administration pulled a loan. You mentioned mandate. That mandate would have to come from the federal government. Is that correct?
Well, I think through NERC, the ISOs and RTOs could actually do it together if they had the time and the resources and the willingness to do it, right? And I do think you're going to see some leadership from some of the ISOs and RTOs to do it, but absent a FERC mandate, absent a NERC standard, they're not going to focus on that. They've got plenty of work to do now just to connect the new loads, to get the new resources online, to retire old units, whatever. There's lots of challenges right now, and if it's not a mandate, it's hard to get people to focus on it.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.